Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri, and our next guests are two of the most successful documentary filmmakers of their time, two people who have devoted their lives to educating audiences about the justice system and the times it's gone wrong, especially with their STARZ show, Wrong Man, now entering its second season. Please put your hands together for Joe Berlinger and Catharine Park. Let's hear it.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Obviously, the new season, 3 new cases, but
One last chance.
one last chance. But let's talk a little bit about what happened last season. I mean, even within the season, we saw Christopher Tapp essentially get exonerated because from the crimes that he committed. But what about some of the other cases that we saw?
Yeah, I mean, what's really, you know, nothing's better for a filmmakers to actually have some impact with your work. You know, I saw that on Paradise Lost, of course. The West Memphis 3 were released after 18 years because of the activism of a lot of people, but the films were the catalyst for that. And with this series, you know, we only had our first season last year where we reinvestigated 3 cases of alleged wrongful conviction, and in each case, you know, I think we came up with some information and results that really had a good impact. You know, I think the most visible one was on the Curtis Flowers case, quadruple homicide in Winona, Mississippi. You know, at a furniture factory. The poor guy's been tried 6 times by the same prosecutor, and also there was a podcast in the dark that also did some great reporting and some other outlets. And I think because of all of this media attention, the Supreme Court, actually in their opinion, the Supreme Court, well, actually in the dissenting opinion, one of the justices said that this case probably would never have made it to the Supreme Court if it wasn't for all the media attention that was received by this case, and we were a big part of that. What happened was that his death sentence was overturned. He's now home out on bail, and the state of Mississippi needs to you know, determine whether they want to try the guy for a 7th time. But the good news is all the pressure, you know, I think forced the prosecutor. The same prosecutor's been on this case for 6 different retrials, and so he finally has recused himself. And the jury, because people of color were eliminated from the jury, that was the basis for the Supreme Court's overturning of the conviction. And we hope, you know, Mississippi may not decide to try it again. That would be great. Not sure where that's going, but the fact that the same prosecutor has finally recused himself after literally trying this guy. He's probably Curtis Flowers is probably the most tried, you know, prisoner in the history of the American legal system. Literally 6 trials, you know, overturned for various reasons. Too complicated to go, you know, through each case, but the Supreme Court finally overturned it. So that was on the Curtis Flowers case, and then on Evaristo Santos, you know, he had no legal representation when he reached out to us. In fact, he wrote me a very, you know, emotional letter that he had seen Paradise Lost and gave all the reasons why he's innocent. That's what prompted us to do the story. To include that in the season, and he, as I said, had no legal representation, and as a result of the work that we did, we got the main Jailhouse snitch, which that's a category that's always a problem, but the main snitch, who actually wasn't a jailhouse snitch, it was somebody with a troubled history.
I should also say, just not to interrupt, but I feel like the word snitch is often used to imply someone that is ratting, for instance, on someone who has done something, but a jailhouse snitch is quite often people who are trading lighter sentences for false testimony.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, it wasn't actually in a jailhouse setting, but it was basically one of the detectives got somebody with an unsavory reputation to point the finger at Evaristo. There's no other evidence really connecting him to the case. And we got that snitch to recant his testimony and take a lie detector test and prove that he was lying, you know, when he pointed the finger at Evaristo. And unfortunately, the officials in Yakima County, Washington, still haven't done anything about the case. But the good news is that because of our investigation, a terrific pro bono attorney has come on board to help file a new motion for a trial, file a motion for a new trial, and we're hopeful that he'll have some justice after 2 decades.
What does that feel like as a documentary filmmaker?
Well, we always like to work on a project that has meaning to us. And so this is incredible meaning that perhaps you've helped someone who may be innocent, and also shedding light on issues in our legal system, I think is important to bring to public awareness.
Because one of the, just to state the obvious, if the wrong person's in prison, it's not just helping out somebody who, has, can you imagine being in prison for something you didn't do for even a day, let alone decades? And these cases take decades to unwind when there's a problem. But the other reason to shine a light on these cases is if the wrong person is in prison, that means the killer is still out, and that's so troubling, and there have been cases that I've covered in other programs where, one of the more famous cases is, in this area, is Jeffrey Deskovic, who was accused of murdering a classmate, and after 15 years, he was finally released through DNA testing. DNA testing that Westchester County fought tooth and nail not to do for years. And I don't understand how prosecutors who want the truth would fight something like DNA testing. You would think if they have such a deep and abiding belief in their conviction, and if DNA evidence shows up, which has been proven to be irrefutable, why not allow the testing to happen? And yet in this case, Jeffrey Deskovic, they resisted DNA testing for years, and in the intervening time, the real killer, who they eventually caught when DNA testing was finally allowed, thanks to the Innocence Project and others, in the intervening years, while the DNA testing was not happening, this person killed a school teacher. And so I think Westchester County, District Attorney's Office, Janine Pirro, who's no longer there.
I'm sorry, who's Janine Pirro?
Who's no longer there. I think that office has blood on their hands. It wasn't until the new DA took over, Janet DiFiore, because Pirro went off and ran for office, and then now has her own media career. The good Westchester County DA, Janet DiFiore, said, of course we should test for DNA. It exonerated him, and they loaded the DNA results into the CODIS system, and it came up with an immediate hit of a guy who's already in prison, who admitted to the killing of Deskovic's victim, and this guy killed a school teacher.
Where do you think this is it a fault within the system that incentivizes these kinds of convictions and holding on to them, as well as the kind of gut instincts of police detectives who are like, no, this is who it is, I see who it is, I don't want to hear anything else outside of that? Or is it human fallibility?
I think there's no easy answer. There's lots of things that lead to wrongful convictions, false confessions. You'd think there wouldn't be such a thing as a false confession, but in Christopher Tapp's case, you're deprived of food, you're deprived of contact, you're berated for 12, 16, 18 hours, and finally you just say you're in such a mental state that you say anything just to get out of that immediate situation. That's what happened with Christopher Tapp. He falsely confessed.
So heartbreaking about that is during the trial, as he was being sentenced, the judge essentially says, in a way, I don't want to sentence you. If we didn't have this confession, there's no way there would be a conviction.
Exactly.
Kind of the tone of his voice, I know I'm implying a lot here, but it sounded as if he was saying, this confession isn't right, but the jury has done this, and I now have to sentence you.
Exactly. And people think confessions are so rock solid, and when you play that tape in a room, in a trial, it's very compelling. But if you don't play all of the context and the physical state of the person, if you watch all of the tapes instead of just the highlighted piece of the final moment, when you see all of the tapes, you see the context, and you understand how. In fact, the mother of the murder victim was a 18-year-old named Angie Dodge. The mother of the murder victim, at first hated Christopher Tapp and thought, believed the police, but then when she watched all of the confession tapes in context, she became his biggest advocate and felt the wrong person was in prison. But there's all sorts of things that lead to wrongful convictions, so it's hard to say what is the root cause or is it systemic. But the one thing that, I think is the biggest issue for me, having done this now for 3 decades, and again, I shouldn't say again, I didn't say it yet. I want to say that not every cop is bad. There are a lot of great cops who are doing a great job. It's not an easy job. There's a lot of great people in law enforcement and prosecutors who care about the truth, but there's enough bad apples, or there's enough people who care about getting reelected, that I think the biggest problem with our criminal justice system is that the prosecutor has tremendous power and very little responsibility. There's, prosecutorial misconduct is hard to prove. People are rarely censured for holding holding back evidence. It's very hard to hold a prosecutor accountable because of this. There's a doctrine in the law called prosecutorial immunity, because, in many places prosecutors are, paid public servants. They don't have a great salary. And the argument goes that if a prosecutor could be held personally responsible for the outcome of a case, you wouldn't get good prosecutors wanting to take that risk and take the job. And, again, there are many people who are in this system who aren't out for themselves, but there's enough examples where prosecutors are just afraid to admit mistakes, where they hold on to the outcome, where they do things that are not on the up and up, and they're not held responsible because they're immune from their actions as a prosecutor. And I think that's got to change. They got to figure out how to hold prosecutors more accountable. Like this prosecutor Doug Evans 6 times, trying the same guy. It's like, I don't know, crazy to me.
I'm curious if it feels like you work on a form of counter-programming, because by and large, the majority of criminal justice documentary work on television, narrative fiction work on television is about police officers or prosecutors getting the job done, finding the killer, putting him on trial, throwing him behind bars. Rarely do we get stories of wrongfully convicted people. I think that's kind of changing a little bit, but by and large, I think for the last 20, 30 years, both doc and Law and Order shows or anything like that, the cops are inherently doing the right thing. Does it feel like you are presenting a form of counter-programming, or at the very least, counter-programming our own psyches?
Well, I would put it that we're pointing out issues in our legal system and in law enforcement that can go wrong. That, we were talking about police, how they look at a case. Sometimes there's what we call tunnel vision, which is a wrongful conviction marker. So they're, they get a lead and they just go with that, to the exclusion of other evidence that may be quite important. So I think it is a counter to this kind of filmmaking, a counter to a status quo. But again, a lot of our lawyers and judges are terrific.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Talk about working with your eccentric cast of detectives, again, who I love. And honestly, when I think of counter-programming, I think of the defense lawyer that you work with, who even says in his introduction, "I've been fighting the criminal justice system," or "I've been fighting cops since I started doing this." Talk about casting this motley crew. Where did you find them? They're so great.
Well, the idea for the show was mine, and I wanted to not just kind of have filmmakers reinvestigate, which we did in Paradise Lost, and some other shows. I actually wanted to really dig in and come up with results. So we assembled kind of a dream team, a motley crew, as you say. But Ron Kuby is one of the leading, criminal defense attorneys and civil rights lawyers in the nation. And he's, he is definitely an eccentric guy, but like brilliant. And so we have him. We have a former prosecutor named Sue Ann Robinson, who's terrific. Ira Todd is actually just retired, but right?
Yes.
Ira he was until very recently an active homicide detective in Detroit with a real specialty in interrogations. And when you watch the series, he's the one, for example, who got Evaristo Santos' snitch to come clean, admit that he was lying, and then take a lie detector test to confirm that he was lying at the trial. That takes a special interrogator to get, and then he confronted the police officer about it involved, or the detective involved. That's a special kind of, he's fantastic in getting people to kind of, and you'll see in season 2, I don't want to, spoil it, but in season 2, one of the people we follow, the case takes a little bit of an unexpected turn, and he's the key to that too. The interrogation in that episode is fantastic. It's like edge of your seat. And I should mention, by the way, that 2 of the 3 cases this year are women. Even though the show is called Wrong Man, we decided this year to focus on, statistically, there's far fewer women in the criminal justice system, and obviously far fewer women who therefore are claiming wrongful conviction, but we thought it'd be interesting to focus on some women cases this year. So 2 of the 3 cases are female, and in one of the female cases, this Ira Todd, the homicide detective, gets a hair-raising result none of us were expecting. And then we have Joe Kennedy, who was a former government investigator, NCIS investigator, right?
Yes.
Um,
And just a really good, has a really good nose for,
And specializes in forensics.
right, yeah, exactly.
In particular, which always plays a part in crime investigation.
How did you go about researching and finding the subjects for this year's subjects? Yeah.
Well, some people write to Joe. That's how he got Evaristo's case. One of Vonda Smith's family members wrote to Joe about the Vonda Smith case. The other ones, we talked to innocence projects across the country. One of the key things is getting access, because it's one thing we think, well, there's a lot of issues with this particular case, and that's an interesting case, but if we don't have what they call the discovery files from, and support of the defense attorney, then we're kind of,
You can't do a show.
We can't
Yeah.
really do a show. So we look at that. So we look at things where we have that, but also really compelling cases where there's something, something's fishy here, or everything isn't always adding up, and it's a case that does merit looking into.
And the sad reality is there's many more cases of alleged wrongful conviction than we could ever do a TV show about that. Even if the top 50 filmmakers decided to each do a wrongful conviction story, there are many more cases. And I go to bed every night with a very heavy heart, knowing I get letters from some people that it's just doesn't have the elements to do a TV show. A lot of practical considerations, and so it really shouldn't be up to filmmakers to fix the system. The system, there are, once you are convicted of something, it takes friggin' forever to undo it. 2 decades, sometimes 3 decades to unwind a bad action, and that's the thing that's got to change. Is like prosecutors have to be held accountable for bad actions, and the system needs to work. I think there needs to be a law against denying post-conviction DNA testing, for example. The moment DNA becomes available, it shouldn't even have to be litigated in court as to whether or not that, and with all due respect to victims, obviously I don't want to sound insensitive to victims, but victims and law enforcement should want to know if that conviction is on solid grounds. Nobody should, it boggles my mind that people fight DNA, post-conviction DNA testing, particularly in a case when the technology was, 20 years ago wasn't available, or if new DNA surfaces. There have probably been 360 DNA exonerations, and 20 of them have been on death row. That means this country was going to put to death 20 people who were factually and actually innocent. And if it wasn't for DNA, those people would have been killed. I mean, do we want to, it's why I'm also virulently anti-death penalty, not out of any moral reason that you shouldn't have a death penalty, but, the execution of one innocent person means to me you can't have that system. But that's an issue for another day.
Especially cases where there is no connection between the evidence, the DNA evidence found at a crime scene, and the person who's ultimately convicted. That's a red flag, right? Because they find DNA, but it's not that person. That's what happened in the Chris Tapp case. In this season, the Kenneth Clare case. None of the evidence, and there was a lot at the crime scene, links back to him.
How did you get involved making documentary work like this? I mean, true crime, a lot of your work is true crime based or crime based, right? Or law enforcement based. How did that start for you? I know how it started for Joe and what he started working on, but what about you?
Well, I started from the bottom. I worked my way up from a production assistant up. There's a lot of true crime in New York, but it's also, for me, people say, why do you like to do crime shows? And one of the reasons is it's the ultimate story. If a story, drama, the stakes have to be high. It's life and death. Well, this is the ultimate story.
Joe, when you made your first documentary, Brother's Keeper, right? That was a crime story, and then you followed it up with Paradise Lost. Did you think that did you already have a fascination with the criminal justice system, or was that developed through the course of making those movies, and then you kind of couldn't stop thinking about it and wanted to keep telling stories within it?
I think it was the latter, to be honest with you. Brother's Keeper, documentary was in a very different state at the time, and these quirky, ambiguous human character portraits weren't, which were so popular in the 60s, had kind of, that style of filmmaking, that verite style of filmmaking, had kind of died out. And so when we made Brother's Keeper, we picked this quirky murder trial more because of the characters and the circumstances. These four brothers living in the same bed together in this ramshackle shack in upstate New York, and the town thought they were innocent. And we just saw a quirky, great story to follow. And luckily he was acquitted, so there was no the system worked actually in that story. So that film was purely just an aesthetic exercise in pushing the envelope of what a documentary could be. And it's been very gratifying that a lot of younger filmmakers have cited that film as the film that made them want to become a filmmaker. Morgan Spurlock has said that, Simon Kilmurray has said that, Brett Morgan has said that. So it's that film really touched a nerve just more stylistically, which then led us to Paradise Lost. But Paradise Lost, Sheila Nevins at HBO sent us this article that these three teenagers had just been arrested for these horrendous devil-worshipping murders of 3 8-year-olds. And when we went down to make that film, we embedded in that community about 7 months before the trials, a week after the arrests. On a scale of 1 to 10, the prosecution was saying it's an 11. All the local media were convinced they were guilty. So we went down thinking we were making a film about guilty teenagers. And it was in the course of making that film that we realized, no, just the opposite. These guys look like they're innocent. And we couldn't believe we sat through a murder trial where there was that was my wake-up call, was making Paradise Lost. There was no forensic evidence connecting these guys to the crime scene, virtually no evidence at all. And they were doing things like introducing Metallica lyrics into evidence because, Damien Echols liked Metallica, and somehow that implied...
They had a confession, right?
Well, right, they did have a confession, but when you analyze the confession, it was a classic false confession, and he kept changing he was not an intelligent guy, Jesse Miskelly, and under pressure they kept changing the facts and the times. And when you look at everything in context, you see that it was a completely bogus confession. So, but literally no blood at the crime scene. So we think it was a dump site, not the crime scene, and no physical evidence connecting these guys to the crime. And somehow we had this hope that it would all work itself out at trial like it did in Brothers Keeper. But the last scene of Paradise Lost is you see Eccles and Baldwin being chained up and led off to death row. Well, one to death row, one to life without parole. And we had halfway through the film, there was the first trial because the 3 defendants were separated. And he was also Jesse Miskelly sent to life without parole. But when we saw Damien being chained up and led off to death row, that was our wake-up call, like, wow, the system can really be screwed up and that we're sitting on something that can help somebody. And that was kind of my wake-up call as a filmmaker, that it's not just the aesthetic experience of presenting a good story, that these films, we have a responsibility and we're sitting on something that could actually change the outcome of this case. Little did we know it would take 2 more films and 20 years before there was an outcome, but that was kind of my wake-up call, that the system is flawed and it might be a good place to park myself as a filmmaker.
Did you feel like at that moment you had decided to dedicate your time as a filmmaker, the majority of your life, because you've made other kinds of films as well, but the majority of your life as a filmmaker to cases like that or stories like that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was an area of specialty that I wanted to, spend time in. I mean, it gets dark, it's dark subject matter, so every once in a while I've made a music film or something a little lighter like the Tony Robbins film or whatever, but I feel like, my calling is to try to shine a light on criminal justice reform.
And what's interesting about this Wrong Man and these types of shows that Joe is discussing is that we don't know what's going to happen when we start the production. We don't know what we're going to find out, So that's one of the challenges. Is it's wonderful for the show, but it's also a little bit nerve-wracking for the producer.
Have there been stories that you've been tracking and then it just doesn't go to somewhere that is a satisfying conclusion or an interest that you had to pull back from?
No, I wouldn't say not satisfying conclusion. It's more, oh boy, I didn't see that coming. Mm-hmm. And that's true in this season of Wrong Man.
I think we have time for a couple questions from the audience. Who's a question? Hi, right here.
Hi.
Hello.
Since you guys work around these cases all the time, how do you get out of that place? I know this is really emotionally draining, so.
Like in our personal life, how do we get out of it? Well, luckily I have a great marriage, great life partner, and my wife Lauren helps me get out of it. It does. You take these things home, and it weighs heavily. I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes thinking about issues related to something I'm covering, but I always hold on to hope that we have a good outcome. The Paradise Lost experience was an amazing experience for a filmmaker to have. These guys literally got out of prison, because the films were a catalyst to get people to do something about the case.
But also a great example, once again, of prosecutors unwilling to admit wrongdoing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, because that case ended in a cowardly Alfred plea. I think that's what you're referring to. So these guys had to plead guilty to times, and in exchange got time served. So they walk out of prison as convicted killers. But the whole reason Arkansas did that is they didn't want to be sued for wrongful conviction, and which is it could be $1 million a year for every year of wrongful conviction times 3. That's almost $60 million that they were seeking to avoid a lawsuit. And also just the basic human thing of not wanting to admit you made a mistake, because those officials, the judge, the prosecutor who's now a judge, those were all elected officials.
Is there any pursuit of still overturning those convictions? Are they allowed to do that?
Well, it's tricky. That's, look, the Arkansas, and this is why it's so infuriating, because the real killer is out free. So that it's not just they got the wrong people out, but if they're doing it under an Alford plea in which these guys were forced to plead guilty, you know, you stand up in court and you say, they were forced to say, well, the prosecution has enough evidence to convict us even though we are maintaining our innocence. We are publicly declaring we're innocent, but in order to get out of death row, I'm admitting that the prosecution has a strong enough case to convict me, even though, hey, I'm innocent. That's what they make you do.
That was true in the Christopher Tapp
And
case.
Chris Tapp case as well. And so
I thought he was completely exonerated.
He was later.
Oh, okay.
so the reason they do that is nobody has to admit they made a mistake. Nobody loses their job. The state doesn't get sued for wrongful conviction. But does anyone really think that the state of Arkansas truly believed that these guys are still guilty if they let them out of prison? These are 3 teenagers who were accused of taking 3 8-year-olds into the woods and sacrificing them to the devil in a satanic ritual. If the state of Arkansas really believes they're letting those guys out of prison early, you know, after 18 years, then shame on them if they're letting those kinds of killers on the streets. And if they're, but it's clear they don't believe they're guilty, and so shame on them for not fully accepting responsibility. And it's a problem for these guys. Like Jason Baldwin would love to become a lawyer, but he's a convicted felon. He can't. I took these guys to the Toronto and Berlin film festivals, and so crossing the border becomes a problem because they give their passport and, oh, you're a convicted killer. We had like hours on the border in Germany before we could, you know, go to the festival, you know, dealing with, I mean, there's...
Where you like bring copies of the movies and the hours are spent showing border guards.
Exactly.
Paradise Lost 1, 2, and 3.
Look, they're innocent. So it's very cowardly when
the context?
when the state does that. I forgot the larger point I was making. How do you handle taking these stories home, by the way? That was actually her question.
Well, I try to feel like, you know, whether or not I'm involved or we're doing the show, it still happened. And so if something isn't done, it's darker. That's how I feel about it. If we aren't looking into it, we're in a darker place. So that helps me get through the sadness of these stories.
One more.
Hi. As directors working with the wrongly convicted police and prosecutors, how difficult is it getting these people to open up to you and share their stories, or are they willing and wanting to share?
Well, I mean, let's just say the people who put the people behind bars are the hard ones. They often don't want to talk to us. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they don't. And the people who are claiming to be wrongfully convicted welcome the platform. And you know, sometimes family members are tough. Victims' family members, you want to, you know, it's a very tricky thing. I mean, I have nothing but reservoirs of sympathy, obviously, for the victims' families. And unfortunately, in a lot of these cases, the Chris Tapp case was the opposite and unusual. As I mentioned, the mother actually of the victim became Chris Tapp's biggest advocate, which was an amazing thing. But for the most part, families of victims, and you can understand that you go through this horrible trauma, and there's no real closure to losing a loved one. You know, that's a pain that never goes away, but at least there's finality to it when the perpetrator is put away, and you know, they at least feel their loved one got justice. And so people like us come along and disturb that, and it's very, I can understand why people have a hard time with us, and not people, the victims' family members have a hard time with what we do, because their healing process, again, and the pain never goes away, but the healing process of knowing at least justice has been served, you know, that's predicated on knowing the person's in prison. And when we come along and say, well, what you've believed for 20 years might not be right, I mean, that's that interaction is always the hardest, wouldn't you say, with the families of the victims who don't want to believe the person is wrongfully convicted?
Sure. I mean, I can absolutely, anyone can sympathize with a family member who believes that the right person is in prison. And my hope is that when they see the show, we're presenting the case, and we're presenting all the facts and looking at all the facts, and that wherever that leads. And so, you know, hopefully the victims' families also, who have participated, as well as some prosecutors, some not, but we always want to tell a balanced story. And I think that, you know, justice doesn't have an end date. You know, you want to look at this, and if someone that I was in my family who was murdered, I would want to know for sure that everything was looked at, and that the right person was in prison.
Well, the new second season of Wrong Man premieres February 9th on STARZ. It's incredible work that the two of you do. Thank you so much for doing it and shining a light on these people.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Everybody give Joe and Catherine a huge round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.